April, 1814. The man who had once kept all of Europe awake at night stepped off a boat and onto a small island in the Mediterranean. It was not a kingdom, not a fortress, not even a prison in the usual sense. It was Elba, a scrap of land small enough to cross on horseback in a matter of hours. Barely 12,000 people, far too small for a name that had once shaken an entire continent. To Europe, this was the end. The kings believed it. The emperors believed it. The generals believed it. Napoleon Bonaparte was finished, but there was one problem. The only man who did not believe that was Napoleon himself. Each morning, he woke in a modest villa facing the sea. No triumphal boulevards, no endless imperial guard, no velvet halls where ambassadors waited for a single nod. Now there were plain walls, simple furniture, and a window opening onto blue water he was never supposed to cross. The man who had commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers now inspected fishing docks. The man who had redrawn the map of Europe now settled local disputes between islanders. Everything about his life had been reduced. The British assigned an officer named Neil Campbell to watch him. The assignment was simple. Keep an eye on Napoleon, make sure he stayed on Elba, and send regular reports back to London. Campbell saw what looked like a calm former emperor. A man who rode horses, took walks, read books, and kept busy with small projects. He thought he was watching a fire burn itself out. What Campbell did not understand was what Napoleon was reading. Not novels to pass the time. News, letters, fragments of information slipping in from the mainland. Every newspaper, every rumor, every private message reached him like ammunition waiting to be loaded. Napoleon read everything. He read about France after his fall, and with every line, his eyes grew sharper. Louis XVIII sat on the throne, but peace had not followed. Soldiers who had fought for France for 20 years were dismissed with humiliation. Many were denied pensions. Veteran officers were pushed aside so old aristocrats could step back into positions of privilege, men who had spent the dangerous years safely abroad while others bled. The promises born in the French Revolution were being peeled away piece by piece. Equality, once spoken like destiny, now sounded like a memory. Napoleon no longer had a throne, but he still had something far more dangerous. He understood France. Then the visitors began to arrive, quietly, carefully. Officially, they were harmless guests. In reality, they were former officers, loyal supporters, men who still called him Emperor once the door was closed. They all brought the same message in different words. France was angry. The army missed him. The people were disappointed. And most important of all, everyone believed nothing could be done about it. Napoleon had been removed from the board. Everyone except Napoleon. He began to calculate. Not like a dreamer clinging to the past. Like a commander still fighting the war inside his head. He knew the French coastline almost by memory. He knew which regions were stronger for the Bourbons and which were weaker. He remembered which regiments had once followed him most fiercely. He knew where his portrait still hung. He knew which roads from the south could lead to Paris while avoiding the strongest centers of resistance. Then he noticed something small. Campbell often left the island, regularly, predictably, long enough to create a gap, a small gap to anyone else, a door to Napoleon. He kept riding, kept reading, kept looking calm. But underneath that still surface, a return was being built with the care of a buried explosive. Then came February 1815. Napoleon had almost everything he needed. News from France, discontent in the army, the remains of loyalty, a plan. He lacked only one thing: timing. On February 26th, Campbell left Elba again for the Italian mainland. Another routine trip. He was expected back in a few days. Napoleon stood watching the British vessel shrink against the horizon. Sea wind struck his face. Then he turned to his chief of staff. "We leave tonight." And at that moment, history began to move again, because the man Europe had exiled to a tiny island was now preparing to re-enter France with just 700 men. And the maddest part was this. He was not planning to hide. He was planning to walk straight into the heart of it, and what came next would make the whole thing seem impossible. Night fell on February 26, 1815. The harbor at Portoferraio was black and silent. No torches, no drums, no shouted orders, only shadowed figures moving in the dark, loading crates, muskets, supplies, and men into small boats. 7 vessels in all. Not a fleet. Barely more than fishing boats and transport craft, fragile enough that one bad turn of weather could have swallowed the entire dream. But the men boarding them were not frightened stragglers. They were veterans, men who had marched through Austerlitz, Wagram, and Moscow, faces carved hard by war, men who had seen the empire rise and collapse, yet still chose to follow him one more time, not because the odds were good, because they believed in the man walking the dock beside them. Napoleon inspected each vessel himself. He spoke to the soldiers. His voice was calm, his stride steady. There was nothing in him that looked desperate. One officer stepped closer and asked the question that must have been haunting every man there. "What if the royal troops are waiting on the beach for us?" Napoleon did not stop walking. "Then we deal with them on the beach." The officer kept staring at him. "And if they outnumber us?" Napoleon answered without changing expression. "They will outnumber us. That is not the question." He turned toward him. "The question is whether they will fire." That was the entire plan in one sentence. Not defeat the French army. Make the French army unable to pull the trigger. Around midnight, the little flotilla slipped out of harbor. Napoleon's main vessel was disguised as a British ship, flying British colors, moving through the darkness beneath the flag of the very nation assigned to keep him confined. Black sea, black sky, and a future just as dark. If they were discovered out there, it would end on the water. No Paris, no return, no 100 days. Just a short report. Bonaparte captured while fleeing Elba. On the second day at sea, that fear nearly became real. A French royalist warship appeared offshore and moved toward them, close enough to identify them, close enough to expose everything. One sharper eye on that ship and the whole gamble collapsed. Napoleon ordered the soldiers below deck. Complete silence. Then he himself remained visible, standing in uniform, as though he had nothing at all to hide. The 2 vessels drew alongside each other. A voice called across the water. Napoleon's captain answered with the most ordinary question possible. "Any news from Elba?" The officer on the other ship replied casually, like a man discussing weather. "Everything is quiet. Bonaparte is still there. The ships passed. History brushed death at sea by only a few yards. On March 1st, Napoleon landed on the coast of France. No music, no ceremony, just sand, wind, and 700 men stepping onto soil where any of them could be dead within days. More than 1,000 kilometers lay between them and Paris. Behind them was the sea. There was no retreat. The news spread fast. Royal troops began moving to intercept. From any conventional military point of view, Napoleon should have disappeared into the hills, avoided contact, bought time, fought like a fugitive. Instead, he did the opposite. He marched north, straight toward Paris, straight toward armies far larger than his own. Why? Because he understood something deeper than terrain or troop numbers. A soldier's loyalty does not always live in the flag above him. Sometimes it lives in memory, in old campaigns, in a familiar face, in the feeling that his life once meant something under another man's command. On March 7th, near Grenoble, that truth was tested. A royal regiment blocked Napoleon's path. Muskets loaded, formation set. If this story was going to end in a burst of gunfire, this was the place. One order, and 700 men would be shattered. Napoleon halted his column roughly a kilometer away. His officers waited for commands. Form the line. Bring up the guns. Try a flanking move. Find another road. Napoleon did something no one expected. He walked toward them, alone, unarmed. His officers were horrified. They tried to stop him. They reminded him that the muskets ahead were loaded and ready. Napoleon did not turn back. He gave only a short reply. "Then we shall know." The road between them fell silent. Behind him, 700 veterans held their breath. Ahead of him stood French soldiers in Bourbon uniform, muskets leveled at his chest. An order rang out. "Hold position. Wait for the command to fire." But between those two lines there was only the sound of one exiled emperor walking toward death. Napoleon kept coming. 50 yards, 30, 20. Close enough to see their eyes, close enough for them to see his. Then he stopped, slowly took off his hat, opened his coat, and exposed his chest. No long speech, no plea, just a few words thrown straight into the hearts of the men in front of him.
"Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, if any man among you wishes to shoot his emperor, here I am." He took one more step. Fire. No one fired. The commanding officer kept shouting, but his voice was already shrinking against what was happening in the ranks. These were not mercenaries, not foreigners. They were French soldiers. Some had marched under Napoleon before. Some had shouted his name before battle. Some had nearly died in campaigns that now lived only as scars and private memories. One musket lowered, then another, and then, from somewhere in the line, a cry broke loose. "Vive l'Empereur!" One heartbeat later, the entire regiment erupted, but not toward him with violence, toward him with surrender and devotion. Men rushed across the road, surrounded Napoleon, seized his hands, reached for his coat, laughed, cried, shouted his name, as if a part of themselves they thought was gone had suddenly returned. The regiment sent to stop him became his regiment without a single shot being fired. That was the moment the campaign changed shape. This was not an invasion. It was a seizure of the French imagination. By nightfall, Grenoble opened its gates. Napoleon entered the city in triumph. 6 days on French soil. No bloodshed, no major battle. Only the spreading force of a loyalty everyone had assumed was dead. But now the most dangerous figure of all entered the story. A man whose decision could still destroy everything. Marshal Ney, war hero. The man the Bourbons trusted to end this. The man who had sworn before the king that he would bring Napoleon back to Paris, in an iron cage. And when an old oath collides with an older loyalty, France is forced to choose. What happened next was the moment the throne truly began to shake. On March 10th in Paris, Louis XVIII summoned Marshal Ney. The room was crowded with ministers, courtiers, and officers. Everyone understood the danger. Napoleon was advancing north, growing larger by the day, more difficult to stop with every hour. If there was one man with enough authority to hold the army in place for the Bourbon monarchy, it was Ney. Decorated, scarred, proud, a soldier made of battlefield steel. The king made it plain for everyone in the room to hear. "Bonaparte is marching on Paris. You must stop him." Ney did not hesitate. He answered in the language courts love most, certainty. He would ride south. He would arrest Napoleon. He would bring him back to Paris in an iron cage. The court relaxed. Applause rose in the room. At last, they believed they had a wall. Ney departed with roughly 6,000 men, well-trained, fully armed, backed by royal authority. By every military measure, this should have been the end. Napoleon had only a few hundred. than a few thousand. Ney had numbers, legitimacy, and the prestige of his own name. But as he moved south, the ground beneath him was changing faster than orders from Paris could keep up. Reports flooded in. There had been no battle like the court expected, no serious resistance. Regiments sent to block Napoleon were defecting to him instead. Cities expected to close. Their gates were opening them wide. Crowds lined the roads. Flags waved. Napoleon's name moved ahead of him like a wave. And then Ney's own soldiers began receiving letters from old comrades, from family, from veterans who had once served beneath the imperial eagle. "Come back. The emperor has returned." Ney ordered the letters ignored. Continue the march. But he could not order memory to fall silent. Then Napoleon sent him a private letter. Not an ultimatum, not a threat. A message from one man to another, from a leader who had shared 20 years of war with him. No one knows with certainty every word that letter contained. But that night Ney read it alone in his tent, and something shifted. Pride, perhaps. Regret, perhaps. Or simply the feeling that history had returned and was calling him by name. The next morning, Ney assembled his men. He held up the letter, read it, then looked across the faces before him. Men wearing medals from old campaigns. Men who had survived things the Bourbon court would never understand. Silence settled over the ranks. Then Ney spoke. "The cause of the Bourbons is lost. I will join him." 2 seconds of silence, then 6,000 men exploded in cheers. In that instant, the king lost more than a marshal. He lost the final illusion that the army still belonged to him. Afterward, Ney rode out to meet Napoleon. The two men looked at each other for a moment. One had just betrayed his king. The other had transformed from an exile into a man who could seize a capital. Napoleon stepped forward and embraced him. No long speech was needed. A promise made in a royal chamber can shatter in a few days. A loyalty forged across 20 years of war dies much harder. Now Napoleon had around 7,000 men and only days left before Paris. Inside the palace, Louis XVIII heard that Ney had changed sides. His face went pale. No one in the room needed an explanation. The board was emptying. Every piece sent to block Napoleon was turning around. The king rose, withdrew to his private rooms, and began packing. No heroic declaration, no great speech to calm the nation. Only fear dressed in royal silk, slipping out of the capital in the dark. By the early hours of March 20th, the throne of France stood empty. 6 hours later, Napoleon entered Paris. The news outran him. He is here. He actually came back. Windows flew open. People poured into the streets. Crowds swelled around Napoleon's carriage until movement became difficult. This was not cold silence for a usurper. It was frenzy. His name shouted from every direction, arms reaching out, flowers thrown into the air, hats lifted high, old veterans forcing their way forward for one chance to touch his hand. Children raised onto shoulders so they could see the man who had gone from a tiny island to the center of power once again. Napoleon stepped back into the Tuileries Palace, through rooms he had left less than a year earlier. The furniture was still there. Papers still lay on desks. The king had fled too quickly to erase himself. That night, Paris celebrated. 19 days. Just 19 days from landing with 700 men to walking again into the palace. No major battle, no storming of fortresses, no river of blood. Every force sent to stop him had been pulled toward him instead, like iron drawn to a magnet. It was one of the boldest returns in history. But this is also where the tragedy truly began. Because while Paris celebrated, Europe heard the same news. Napoleon was back, and the reaction was immediate. The great powers mobilized at once. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers began converging on France from every direction. Napoleon understood there would be no time to enjoy the victory. If he wanted to survive, he had to strike first. He had to crush the Allied armies before they could unite. And now, the final act began. Faster, bloodier, far less forgiving. Napoleon had roughly 125,000 men and a nearly impossible problem. But the answer still bore his signature: speed, separation, and destruction in parts. In Belgium, two Allied armies stood near each other, but were not fully joined. Wellington in the west, Blücher in the east. Napoleon intended to drive a blade between them, smash Blücher first, then turn on Wellington. 2 battles, 2 days. On paper, it was almost perfect. On June 16th, he hit Blücher at Ligny and won. It was savage fighting. The Prussians were driven back. Blücher himself nearly died. The first link in the enemy chain had almost been broken. Napoleon then sent Marshal Grouchy with around 33,000 men and clear instructions. Pursue the Prussians. Do not let them recover. And above all, do not let them reunite with Wellington. Then Napoleon turned west. On June 17th, the rain came down. Roads turned to mud. Guns dragged slowly. The French marched toward Waterloo through weather that seemed determined to hold fate in place. Wellington had chosen strong defensive ground on a ridge. He knew Napoleon was coming. But Wellington was also waiting for something else: Prussian reinforcements. On June 18th, Napoleon delayed the main assault. The ground was too wet. Artillery would be less effective. He waited for the mud to dry enough. 2 hours, perhaps 3. A small decision on the surface. But history often breaks, not with the first great blow, but with delays, hesitations, stretches of time that seem harmless until they are not. And while Napoleon waited for the ground to improve, the Prussians were moving closer. Not away, closer. Grouchy failed to hold them. He was drifting in the wrong direction, following the wording of his orders while missing their spirit. By midday, Napoleon attacked. Wellington resisted with brutal determination. French infantry surged uphill, were thrown back, then surged again. Cavalry thundered forward. Artillery roared. For hours the British line bent but did not snap. Wellington seemed to do little more than absorb punishment and survive. Yet somehow the line held. Then in the afternoon, Napoleon looked east. Dust. Movement. For one brief moment he may have hoped it was Grouchy. It was not. The flags became visible. Prussians. 30,000 fresh troops struck the French right flank just as everything was already stretched to breaking point. Elsewhere, some 20 kilometers away, Grouchy could hear the guns of Waterloo. Officers begged him to march toward the sound. He refused. His orders were to pursue Blücher, and so he obeyed the order while the battle deciding the fate of Europe was dying without him. Napoleon committed the Imperial Guard, his finest troops, his final reserve, men who had almost never failed him. They advanced uphill in perfect formation, as if the last strength of an entire era had been gathered into a single movement. Wellington watched them come, waited, then gave the signal. British fire tore into the Guard. They faltered, pressed forward, were ripped apart again. And then the unthinkable happened. The Imperial Guard broke. It began to retreat. That moment cut the spine out of the French army. When soldiers saw the one formation that never retreated turning back, something inside them collapsed all at once. Withdrawal turned into confusion. Confusion became panic. Men slipped in mud, threw away muskets, and were cut down by Prussian cavalry from behind. An army, rebuilt in 19 days by faith and momentum, dissolved in one rain-soaked afternoon in Belgium. Napoleon watched. For a long moment he only watched. His marshals urged him to leave. Still he looked. Then at last, he turned his horse. The battle had lasted around 8 hours, but in truth, it had been building for months. The miracle of his return had left Europe determined never to give him room for a second mistake. One delay, one misturn, one failure of coordination. And the cost was everything. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. There would be no second Elba. The British would not make the same mistake again. They sent him to St. Helena, a lonely island in the South Atlantic, so distant from any coast that even the thought of escape sounded absurd. There would be no campaign there, no army, no second chance, only the ocean and a man who had once held Europe in his hands, now left with nothing but memory and time. And that is what makes this story so haunting. Napoleon failed in the end, but his escape from Elba remains one of the most astonishing feats in history. Not because he had so few men, not because the road was so long, but because he understood a law of power that very few rulers ever truly grasp. Power does not live only in a throne. It lives in the memory of people who once believed in you, in the feeling that, under your command, they were larger than themselves, in the ability to walk straight toward a line of loaded muskets and know that the strongest force in that moment is not the bullet, but the hesitation in the finger holding it. Napoleon did not return to France with a navy. He did not return with vast wealth. He did not return by winning some brilliant battlefield masterpiece. He returned through psychology, through symbolism, through memory, through the terrifying possibility planted in the mind of an entire nation. If that man still dared to come back, then maybe he had never truly disappeared at all. And sometimes in history, that is enough to bring an empire back to life. If you want, I can turn this into a fully polished YouTube voiceover version with dramatic pacing, emphasis cues, and cleaner cinematic transitions between scenes.